this lack of aggregate demand is one failure of government to serve public purpose, but we seem to have this general case of a system that's not turning out a government that serves public purpose.
Yeah, I think that the post-war period was marked by a framework where the state realised it had to mediate the conflicting demands within the economy between labour and capital, for example, in an aggregate sense, and that it had to do that because it was the agent of the people through the democratic process, and that its objective was well-being, and it had to temper the excessive aspirations of all of the claimants. And I think that the neoliberal era has led to the state abdicating their responsibilities, but in a very explicit way. It's been captured by capital rather than by citizens, and it shifted its policy emphasis. You know, in Britain they say for the many away from the few, and I think that's a good catchphrase on what's happened over the last 30-odd years right around the world. That the state now uses it. The left thinks the state went away, but the right knew that they had to work through the state and capture the state, and that's what's happened. That's the main policy, and the things that Stephanie said are manifestations of that.
Can I go a little more directly to the question about the debt?
Mike?
Oh, microphone, please.
I think mine is on. The little green light's there. The little green light is there. There are. Okay, there is another. Anyway, so more directly on the Fed and central banks in general. The problem is that there's a huge difference between what central banks actually can do and what policymakers and economists and the public in general have come to believe that what they can and should do, and those things are completely different. So the reality is the central bank has very, very little impact on aggregate demand. And so looking to central banks to solve this problem is just the wrong place to look. What central banks do is act as the government's bank, but they never bounce checks. So they are not the cause of inadequate aggregate demand. Whatever the Treasury has been told to spend by Congress, the Treasury spends. So that's not the central bank's fault. The idea that you can manipulate demand by changing the overnight interest rate is just ridiculous. Even in mainstream theory, there's no reason to believe that would work, and it doesn't work. So we sort of moved into this era where the central bank is the Wizard of Oz, and it's all behind a curtain that nobody understands, and somehow they are supposed to have this massive influence on the economy that they just don't have. So I think now the problem is we have too many. So is everyone hearing him over the? Is this now working? No. Why don't you take it? Maybe just take it.
You're good to go.
It works.
Oh, it does?
Yes.
Is this one working?
You're fine.
Oh, okay,
Yep.
now it's working.
Okay.
So anyway, we need to look to Congress to allocate more spending.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems that there are, in terms of the two institutions we have, Congress and the Treasury on one side, Federal Reserve on the other, we have narratives for both that are both shared by like a large portion of the populace and a large portion of policymakers, which is Congress and the Treasury are, the narrative for them is that they are essentially like a household or any like private business, which is they have to go out and get money through tax revenue before they can spend it, and so they have to be careful not to let their spending get too far out ahead of their spending too far ahead of their tax revenue, lest they suffer a debt crisis eventually. And then on the other side, the Federal Reserve. The narrative there is, the Federal Reserve can't let interest rates be too low, lest it, encourage runaway inflation or cause a bubble or whatever. So we have these constricting narratives on both institutions. So I think, do you see that as a problem of institutional design, a problem of politics, a problem of both? Like, where are those narratives rooted in the way we built these institutions and divvied up responsibility, or is it just more a problem of politics, the class antagonism between capital and labor, etc.? How would you characterize that?
I think it's sort of a convenient narratives that the Treasury has to rely on tax revenue like households need to rely on their incomes, and therefore, because the tax revenues are not sufficient to finance more spending, we can't do it that way. Therefore, let's rely on the central bank, which can only manipulate the interest rate, which has, let's say, at best, unpredictable impacts and small impacts on spending. And so we're leaving it up to this committee of experts rather than the political process to make these decisions. They're not subject to voters, and they're supposed to be above the Congress in terms of monetary policy. So it's very convenient to get into a spot where, well, this is the best we can do. Nothing more.
I mean, these institutional structures, just how that manifests, how the output of that structure emerges, is just an expression of the ideological overlay that's put on it. And the Congress and your Congress and your Treasury and central bank, just like central banks and departments of finance everywhere, can do some things under one set of ideological principles and something else under another. The structure can be manipulated and expressed in any number of ways. So to set me up as the boss of the US, I'd have full employment tomorrow. And I'd have a deficit, a fiscal deficit of probably about 2% of GDP, maybe 2.5% at the moment. And I'd sustain that forever. And it would fluctuate a little bit, but these institutions become the tools of the dominant ideology, and the dominant ideology now is that it's anti-government intervention, and except when it's serving the top end of town. And so we've had this convenient framing and language and narrative about central bank independence, despite the fact that that's a myth. And we've had this narrative about fiscal deficits having to be biased towards surplus. That's just an expression of the tastes and fashions of today.
Yeah. And because we've given the Fed, and because Congress has said to the Federal Reserve, it's your mandate, right? It's a dual mandate. It's your job to steer the economy. You give us full employment. You give us low inflation. And then Congress gets to sort of take its fingerprints off of everything because it's the Fed's job. So the Fed both gets credit when the economy does well, in spite of the fact that, as Randy said, it really hasn't, it doesn't deserve the credit. But it also gets all the blame when the recovery doesn't pick up fast enough. People point the finger at the Fed and say, why doesn't the Fed do more? So you remember, in the wake of the financial crisis and as the recovery really took hold, people, this narrative around the Fed doing more. The Fed needs to do more. And so you get all this stuff with QE and Operation Twist and all these things. And all the pressure, all the eyes, all of the attention is on that institution to fix and repair the economy. Meanwhile, the Fed is sitting there pointing a finger at Bernanke, right? That Bernanke is sitting there before Congress and he's getting absolutely raked over the coals. And they're saying, what the hell is going on? You cut interest rates. Why aren't things improving? We basically have zero interest rates. The economy still sucks. And why aren't you doing a better job? And Bernanke's response was, monetary policy is not a panacea. It's not even the ideal tool. And you go, whoa, it's not the ideal tool. It's the tool. We made it the tool. And there is the chairman of the Federal Reserve going, it's not the ideal tool, and it can't fix everything. And what he really was trying to do was go, it's you guys, lend a hand. But because he's a central banker, he can't exactly ask for the fiscal lever to be pulled. So he does it in very careful language, but it was clear what he was saying.
So, essentially, what we need to do is establish that it is Congress, with like I said, the Treasury Department as it's the executor of its will, macroeconomic management lies with Congress, not with the Fed.
Yeah, I did a piece for the Financial Times, and I think the title was dual mandate, right goals, wrong institution. And that was the point I was trying to make there. Full employment and low inflation are the right goals. We've just given responsibility to carry them out to the wrong institution.
Okay, so I think we can get down to some policy brass tacks. The clearest way to boost aggregate demand is, I mean, you can have the government spend more on the welfare state transfer programs, that kind of thing, but the clearest way to boost aggregate demand, I think everyone, at least on this panel, seems to agree, is to hire people. And that could be at the less ambitious end with like a big infrastructure bill, like what Sanders proposed. It could be job guarantee light, which is like what we got out of the Center for American Progress a month or two ago. Or it could be like a full-blown job guarantee where like everybody who like wants a job, we will find a place to put you. So in terms of, you know, just stating Congress's tools and its obligations in passing one of those policies, what are Congress's tools and obligations in terms of passing that policy? What does it need to worry about? What doesn't it need to worry about?
Okay, well, one of the most important thing it needs to worry about is that we've created an electorate that believes the deficit's too large and needs to be brought down.
Right.
And that's what Congress responds to. And they don't seem to care about anything else. I've spoken to several members of Congress who understood what I was saying and just don't care. They can't go there. That's not the narrative their electorate understands. That's not how they're going to get elected, keep the job. And even more, that's not how they're going to be able to raise funds to stay in office. So they have to cater to their donors. So none of it's going to happen until we have some kind of a campaign finance reform that takes that part of it out of the equation.
Well, I think that's a big problem, but Bernie Sanders showed that he could raise money.
Sound.
Oh, sound again for Randall?
For Randy.
Is it on?
Can't hear.
Yeah, to your left.
No. Yeah, we could do that.
I got no more cord on mine.
No, that one.
I think that's on. Yeah. Well, I just said Bernie Sanders showed you actually could raise money without Wall Street, but I agree campaign finance reform would be the best way to go. On the jobs, over the post-war period, the typical way to create jobs, both by Democrats and Republicans, was tax cuts. And the evidence is pretty strong that does not create jobs. It generally increases the net income of higher income Americans. So we do need to create jobs. It's sort of appealing to say, well, we could start small, say job guarantee light. And of course, any job creation would be a good thing if you're creating jobs for people who are unemployed. The problem is that jobs just don't automatically trickle down to the groups that you're not covering. And so you might reduce the unemployment rate for a targeted group, but you're still going to be left with a lot of unemployment. And if you target, say, particularly sympathetic groups, you reduce their unemployment rate, and then you might think, well, we solved the problem, and maybe we can start cutting that program back. So I think the best way to go is the universal. You hit all groups that want to work, and then it has lots of economic advantages that we can go into in terms of the impacts on all of the labor market and the ability to act as a buffer stock so that we don't need to rely on unemployment to fight inflation pressures should they ever arise again. We would have an employed buffer stock that could serve that purpose much more effectively. So the advantage of the universal is, first, you hit everybody, but also you make the labor markets more fair. You will have an effective minimum wage, whatever wages paid in the program will become the minimum wage throughout the economy. Whatever package of benefits you give to that group will become the minimum package of benefits throughout the economy. And you will have an inflation fighting force. So that's why it's much better to go full-blown rather than the job guarantee light or the infrastructure, which also has its own problems, because you're going to be creating jobs largely for men. You're going to leave out females. So this is a big problem of infrastructure alone. And also, once you build it, what are you going to do?
Just following on from what Warren said, you can tinker around the edges with sort of Bernie Sanders, or I'm now using the term Jeremy Sanders, by the way. You can tinker around the edges with those sort of things which at the margin sound and probably are progressive. But they're still being advocated and suggested within the dominant frame. And this is what the point Warren made. The dominant frame is anti all of those things. And the only way that progressives are going to cut through and for an unconditional job guarantee to become just a self-evident truth that is the dominant frame is if we have root and branch change. And the politicians are just sponges. They're just going to adapt to whatever they think they'll get elected, and that's just whatever all of us out here are telling them in their local offices and through various voting systems. And so really the aim of progressives, and this is my prop, Reclaim the State, is that what we've got, this is my book, it's just come out last Thursday, is that what's the progressive movement shouldn't really be putting a lot of energy, in my view, into specific policies just yet. They should be pressuring for a change of frame. Because then all these policies become self-evident. They're just obvious. That's the government has to have a macroeconomic stability framework, job guarantee. It's not a job creation program, it's a price disciplining framework that happens to provide jobs. And then it's got to have infrastructure, and it's not an issue because we've changed the frame. The task is to change the frame.
Yeah, the frame right now, Democrats in particular, right? Access to employment. Like the Republicans with access to health care. And Senator Sanders' response on the health care piece was, well, I have access to a $10 million home, and I don't have a $10 million home because I can't afford a $10 million home. So saying to people that the goal is to ensure that there's access to employment or these ladders of opportunity or whatever. I mean, this is the way the Democrats have framed the jobs question. They want to make sure that workers are well trained. They want to make sure that workers are well educated. They're not even workers. They're unemployed. And so the idea that, training and education is at the root of the problem, and that if you just, do the right thing to the person, then you can, say, okay, I've done my part, now this person can go and find a job. Well, no, they can't, because there are 20 million people who would take full-time work, and there are 4 million job vacancies or whatever. So they have a math problem as well as a framing problem. And to get at the root of the problem, you have to, I think, go the way you've gone with healthcare. If you're going to stand up and say everybody deserves to have this thing, they have to make that thing available to everyone, and that includes employment.
Well, right. I think one way to sum it up might be like the Democrats and many people on the left still accept the employer as like the gatekeeper for access to employment, as opposed to the Democratic public through the government as also being able to provide access on a democratic basis. I have several questions on like the guts of the job guarantee, but first I actually have a good question that gets into this from Sherry Resson. I hope I pronounced your name correctly on Twitter. What are some of your ideas, concretely, for how to change the narrative with the public, for how to communicate to them, for how activists and the party and everyone else can communicate to them the actual nature of the federal government's powers and its obligations as like the macroeconomic stabilizer?
Let me get the first part of that and then continue with what was before. Right now, I think the largest obstacle, of course, is the electorate who doesn't understand what they're voting for, but the largest obstacle on the other side is what I call the headline left. Okay, these are people like Bernie Sanders, like Paul Krugman, who are there to defend, support the progressive agenda and fail miserably doing it. And so I want to, and not only that, make it worse and make it so it's, they become part of the problem rather than part of the answer. So one example, we were just talking about the healthcare debate during the campaign, the presidential campaign. Bernie Sanders was promoted Medicare for all, along with a large tax to pay for it. And of course, Hillary Clinton and the other side points at it and says, see that large tax to pay for it? That shows you we can't afford this. We have to have Obamacare and fix it. And so the whole thing fails because of this tax that becomes associated with it. Now, our perspective would look at it and say, is Medicare for all an inflationary or a deflationary event? Okay, I see it as a highly deflationary event. At the macro level, it saves maybe $500 million of expense on administrative costs in the private sector because they're far more inefficient in administering healthcare than the public sector is when it comes to Medicare for all. And so that represents wages and salaries for people who would lose their jobs. I don't know how many people that is, maybe 5 million people. So here we have a program that's going to add perhaps 5 million people to the unemployment lines. It's going to bring down costs all around the board. Businesses won't be have any healthcare expenses, people won't have any. So this is a deflationary event in the first order. It tends to bring prices down and create unemployment. And in an environment like that, you don't raise taxes to pay for it. That makes no sense at all. You might even be lowering taxes, or you might, how do you pay for it? Well, you have free education, so you get some aggregate demand back on the other side. That's how you pay for it. Okay, that was the massive teaching moment that was lost when the progressive representative adds this tax, and then suddenly, look, he just reintroduced it. It had been in Congress. He got to reintroduce it. It's just Medicare for all without the tax. It only has 16 co-sponsors. What kind of bill is that? He doesn't even have like 10% of the Democrats. Right? It's because the first questions are, well, how are you going to pay for it? You're introducing a bill that's going to cost X trillion dollars with no way to pay for it. Now, the other example of the headline left failing us is Paul Krugman, I mentioned, who says, yes, he concedes we have a long-term deficit problem. Well, he says we need more aggregate demand in the short term. We need some kind of some deficit expansion, but agrees that there's a long-term deficit problem. Okay, and he concedes that. Now, once you conceded that, then and we're talking about entitlements. Can we afford the entitlement programs? Well, he concedes there is a long-term deficit problem, but in the short term we need more deficit spending. But that we do therefore have a long-term entitlement problem. And then they come up with different progressive ways to address it or whatnot. Well, you can't have, if there is a long-term deficit problem, the way it shows up is a long-term inflation problem. So what you do is you look at the 30-year inflation forecast, and they're all at 2%. The Treasury, the CBO, even the free market Treasury index inflation bonds are less than 2% for a long-term inflation forecast. So anyone who claims there's a long-term inflation problem, there's a long-term deficit problem, that there's an overspending problem long-term, has a burden of proof of showing that those inflation forecasts are wrong. So if somebody from the right says to me, we have to cut entitlement, we have to cut Medicare because it's going to be X percent of GDP and everything, and the deficit's going to go up to hundreds of trillions or whatever it is, I'd say, okay, well, the burden of proof, the CBO, the Fed, and the Treasury market tell me that's not going to create an inflation problem. Their forecasts are 2%, that the economy is going to have plenty of capacity to handle all this. The burden of proof is on you to do the math and show me that those three entities are wrong. Okay? And they can't do that because they're not wrong. Because the Fed spends $200 million a year. Maybe they want to spend more to try to prove they're wrong. And CBO is spending money, and the free market is, it's their precious free market of all the market participants' consensus that if we do nothing and let the fiscal go the way it's going right now, the long-term inflation is 1 3/4 or whatever it is. All right, so the argument is easily won that the entitlements are not creating a deficit problem. Okay, and so it's up to the other side. The burden of proof should be on the other side to prove that those forecasts are wrong. Well, what does Paul Krugman do? He concedes there's a long-term deficit problem. Like, what's this? And then he argues, and then he gets shot down on the short-term deficit because, oh, we tried that before and all we did was get more debt. Again, we're just putting it off, we've got to act now. So the beginning of that question is one of our major obstacles, is what I call the headline left. That is just a major obstacle to advancing any kind of progressive agenda right now.
Another point to realise is that these are, in Kuhn's sense, paradigms, neoliberalism and Keynesians and all these things, that the current dominant narrative didn't just emerge overnight. If you go back and trace the political tensions and within the literature, the neo-libs, in the first expression that was probably the monetarists. They were Friedman and co. were working at it through the 50s. And it was only because of the crisis the oil crisis in 74 that gave them cachet to appear credible. But they also, if you go back to 1971, they had Lewis Powell, who became a Supreme Court judge, the most conservative judge in US history, as I understand. He was hired by industry to produce a manifesto, a strategy on how capital was going to take back control. And he had a multi-dimension strategy: take over media, infiltrate education system, infiltrate the judicial system, and create think tanks. And this is when we saw the proliferation of all these very well-funded think tanks. And coupled with coherent political leadership on the right, they were able to become the dominant. And so our task is not an easy one. It's going to take decades to reverse, probably. Because first of all, as Warren said, the political leadership that we look up to on the progressive side is moribund, and that's a compliment. And we don't have very well-funded think tanks. We need much more money coming into groups that are going to advance the narrative and the framing. And that takes a long time. And so to answer the question, don't hang around tomorrow waiting for it. It's going to take a little while. But our task is in perpetuity, not for posterity. It's not for today or tomorrow. Our task is that we're laying foundations, information, narratives, arguments that the next group of young activists are going to take over and wait for that opportunity, seize it with political leadership. It's going to take time.
Sherry's question, to be very simple, I think what she's asking is, what's the simple language to empower regular people to push back against these dominant narratives? How do we do that? And for me, I think the core place to go to your public official when you say, when your representative from Washington comes back to his or her home district, and you're just saying, boy, our roads and bridges really need, or our schools, we need, whatever. They say, oh, I know, it's just awful, isn't it? We'd love to help, but man, we are tapped out in Washington. There's just no money, That's at the point where you say, don't tell me that. Don't tell me there's no money. Don't tell me you have to come to us, right? The money isn't going to come from that's taxpayer dollar. That's when people go, wait a minute. You're a Congress. You're where the money comes from, right? So that's the starting point, I think. You start by pointing out to them that the jig is up. You understand that Congress can authorize the spending, and the money will come from the authorization to spend, and that's the end game. That's it. And then put the onus back on them to tell you why they need your money to finance whatever the project is. I don't think it gets any simpler. When Alan Greenspan says there's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to someone, quote him. Quote him. He's made it very easy for people to turn around and say, we understand they have the capacity. We understand that. And then you get to Warren's point, which is, at some point, you get an inflation problem. If you use the power of the purse, which you clearly have, then there are all kinds of things that can happen as a result. That would be negative. We don't want those things to happen. But don't tell me an environment in which we have 20 million people who want to work and don't have work, our factories are operating at 75% of capacity and so forth. Don't tell me that this is the environment in which to cry poor.
Right. Yeah, I think that's it seems to be like one thing that I think in terms of how I've talked about MMT with people is what throws them off is that first they think you're saying the government has no limiting factor, right? It can just do it at once without, there's never going to be a debt crisis, so it's a free lunch forever. And you're like, no, the limiting factor is inflation. We have put the limiting factor on the deficit to debt load, which is incorrect. It needs to be, the limiting factor is inflation. So then I think it gets to the conversation like, how do we manage inflation? Like, I know we've stated job guarantee as like probably the primary way to do it, but like, what is the toolkit the government should be using for managing inflation, its actual limiting factor?
Well, one is demand, but the problem with trying to use demand as the way to fight inflation is that it is going to reduce demand across the board, and our inflations don't come across the board.
When you say reduce it through demand, are you talking about interest rate hikes or?
Well, those don't. The effect of an interest rate hike is indeterminate, so that's not going to be although I know that that's getting across the board, and inflation is always coming from particular sectors of the economy. So it's much better to target where the inflation is coming from. Typically in the United States, it comes from energy prices, oil prices, and it's pretty senseless to cut demand if OPEC is raising the price of oil. That's not the way to go about fighting inflation. What you really should do is develop alternatives to oil. So we much prefer to have the buffer stock approach, which is rather than trying to cause unemployment to fight inflation, you have a buffer stock that's very effective at fighting inflation, and that is the job guarantee.
Having said that, Randy, a buffer stock is a general policy. It's not a target. It doesn't target bottlenecks in particular sectors.
We're also.
Bill, can you repeat that, what you just said?
What I said was that it was in following on Randy saying we need sector-specific initiatives. The job guarantee isn't a sector-specific initiative; it's a general initiative. And the way the job guarantee works, it's a buffer stock, like an agricultural buffer stock, and that's where the idea for me came from way back. And but the point about it is that if you want to discipline the price pressure, if you want to stabilise the price, you have to let the quantity fluctuate, and you have to let the buffer stock rise and fall. So if you use, job guarantee is no nirvana. The job guarantee requires the state to use its fiscal capacity to transfer resources from inflating sector to the fixed price sector, the job guarantee pool. And the only way it can do that typically would be through indiscriminate spending cuts or tax rises. And it's really beyond the state's information capacity to be able to tailor those spending cuts in any equitable and efficient way to a specific sector that was inflating. And the way in which the job guarantee really works is to attack wage inflation. And that's not necessarily sector specific. So if you really want to have sector specific policies, you'll typically have to use tax policy to do that. So if you've got a real estate sector, so it depends upon the nature of your inflation. If it's coming through your exchange rate, well then you have to do something about that. If it's coming through your real estate markets, then you have to do something about that. A job guarantee won't stop a real estate spiral, which could then filter into the general wage system and then the profit push and what have you, the wage price spiral.
Let's say, how do you think you build like an institutional or policy making framework that like the democratic public would buy into, that would be able to target like sector specific inflation events? Do you have any thoughts on how you do that?
Me?
Yeah,
well,
or anyone.
You do, first of all, in Australia we have this ridiculous policy called, it allows people to invest in housing that they don't live in, and then claim run the loan at a loss, and then wipe the loss against their other income. And of course, if anyone who's cashed up then can go and buy a whole stack of houses and push the price up, and we then get affordability crisis, we get homelessness, and we get this constant. I mean, one member of parliament the other day admitted I think he had 43 houses. Quite, in a cultural sense, that's a lot of houses for Australia.
I would hope it'd be a lot of houses anyway.
Well, the solution to the specific solution to and we have this huge price boom in housing. The solution is to wipe out the tax incentive that's driving the investment in excessive investment in housing, which is diverting money from investment in productive capacity. So that's one example. You just have a tax initiative that would really reduce the incentive for people to do that.
So we've got two historical narratives, things that were spun that are creating both of these problems. So one is that the Clinton surpluses caused the good times, when the fact is that the Clinton surpluses is what ended the good times. Okay, and that just got reinforced in the last campaign as one of the things Hillary Clinton was running on, was that we're going to bring back the surpluses in good times. So that's got to go. And I don't think there's any economist that would support that, the idea that the surpluses caused a good time. So, but it hasn't been done. The second one is that Volcker cured the great inflation with his high interest rate policy. That was the medicine we needed. When on a look back, you can see the price of oil had gone from $3 a barrel to almost 40 after control went from the Texas Railroad Commission to Saudi Arabia due to supply chains, and they had a very different reasons for setting price than the Texas Railroad Commission. One was for stability, the other was destabilizing. And so in 1978, Jimmy Carter deregulated natural gas, and that caused the supply of natural gas to go up. The price went up, but the supply went up, and then the U.S. major utilities, Florida Power and Light, these types of people switched from oil to natural gas. There was a massive supply shock. OPEC had to cut production. Well, they did. They cut production by 15 million barrels a day trying to support the price. They couldn't do it. They drowned in their own oil, and the price came down from 35 and 40 down to $10. And that's what ended the great inflation. The high interest rates actually prolonged great inflation. The high rates are an inflationary bias through the cost structure of businesses and the interest income channels. And so you saw inflation come down relatively slowly. It took 10 years for inflation to come down from 12 to 3 as interest rates were lowered from 12 to 3, inflation came down along with them. Today, if we have a drop in oil prices with interest rates low, you see the CPI go negative almost immediately. Back then, because of the high interest rates, they were supporting inflation. So what I'm saying is we've got these two narratives. One is that the central bank cured inflation when it had nothing to do with it. It was a supply adjustment like Bill was talking about. At Randy, it was a micro adjustment where we substituted lower cost energy in there. And the idea that surpluses cause the good times. But these two things are embedded and implicit and assumed, whatever you want to call it, behind all the discussions in Washington. And those two things have to go. Yeah.
So we talked about housing, and in addition to the tax advantages being cut, most of the housing bubbles are fueled by lending, and so you clamp down on the lending. That's another way to go after that. Energy, if it comes from the supply side, the free marketers ought to say, you don't fight it, okay? It's a relative, you substitute, okay? That's what the Japanese did, and they became twice as energy efficient as we did in response to OPEC increasing the price of oil. Instead, we depressed demand to try to fight energy prices. Food, so there's also a food story that's a contributor to inflation in the United States. And there are policies you could use, such as get rid of the stupid policy of using our food to produce gasoline Okay, that is jacking up the price of grains and raising food prices. And then finally, inflation can come from your most advanced sectors. And in the Western world, this is your military-industrial complex. This is where wage pressure leads to rising prices. And that one also is pretty easy. You can target that one. You can say, either we're going to hold the price for the output that we purchase, or you can stop buying it. And that will reduce inflation pressures there.
And healthcare. I mean, there's another major driver of those measures of inflation, CPI measures. So negotiate run prices and go to single payer. But it's so strange that we're having this conversation about how to deal with inflation when most of the world is struggling and failing for decades to try to move the needle on inflation, despite all efforts to generate some of this stuff. We simply can't seem to get it up, and yet there's this.
To get out of a hole, first you have to stop digging, right? So we're fighting deflation right now. Second of all, inflation is not an economic problem. Every study that's ever been done, one of them was done, showed inflation rates up to 40% don't affect growth, output, employment, or the standard of living. They have distributional issues. People hate inflation, but it's a political issue. It's not even an economic issue. It's not like something bad happens to the economy if you have inflation. But people don't like it, so you have to be sensitive to that issue. And so we're talking about this. But the other thing I want to say is that MMT has the only explanation of the price level of any of the schools of thought. No one has any idea where the price level comes from. That's where they have inflation expectations, costing it, this type of thing. We know beyond this, we've determined beyond dispute and said that the price level is a function of prices paid by government when it spends. Okay, and that is the end of it. The currency is a public monopoly, the government's price setter, and that's where the price level comes from. And that's when you address the problem from that angle, if it isn't, the political problem, it's not an economic problem. If you address the political problem from that angle, you would come up with the right answers that serve public purpose.
Bill mentioned something earlier that I wanted to go back to, which is kind of the question of the information problem, the ability of government, just in terms of practical logistics, how complex an effort can it actually engage in. With the job guarantee, for instance, you would have, I know I've talked to people and they said, well, you'd have local offices around the country all having to place people in the right job, find people who need something done, figure out how to put them together, all that kind of thing. How much do all of you worry about how much information the government can process, how targeted or general do its efforts need to be in turn, and how much does it need to leave to the private sector to coordinate all that kind of thing? Both in terms of the job guarantee, but also in terms of fixing the price level, determining attacking different inflation events, that sort of thing.
The debate in the sort of 1940s and 50s about whether socialism was possible or not. This was the so-called calculation debate, and von Hayek and Oscar Langer and these characters. And the socialists outlined a very elegant mathematical framework in which planned economy could work. But in a way, Hayek's argument about information was correct in those days because to replicate a market through a planned system requires quite immediate feedback systems. Now we've solved all of those because you can have planning, because we've now got computer networks that could provide second by second consumer choice information. So that's the first point to note. The second point to note is that during the true full employment era, in the post-war period up until sometime in the 70s and 80s, depending which country you come from, the national governments had, and the language was reflected the gender bias of the era, but they had manpower planning agencies. And these were occupational forecasting agencies, and these were very elaborate structures of generating forecasts of where likely labour demand would be, what infrastructure would have to go. And so they dovetailed into infrastructure agencies within government like housing and transport and all of those sort of things. And they had it wasn't perfect, but they had a pretty good idea of where apprenticeships had to be offered to train up labour in different areas, and so on and so forth. And they had projects designed and ready to go. And one of the problems during the recent fiscal stimulus was that the neoliberal era has hollowed out government so much that the skills of the true full employment period, of having project management skills, project design, implementation and execution type skills have been lost. And so the starting point to run a cyclical response type job guarantee with associated infrastructure has to be also to restore that planning and person power framework, planning frameworks and infrastructure planning. You know, the Japanese have a better idea, and now the Chinese too. They've got elaborate long-term plans that can be switched on and off depending upon the cyclical state of the economy. And that's sort of that sort of machinery in the state has to be built, as well as to have a job guarantee, so that when you do have people turning up to your job guarantee agency at the local level, remember the job guarantee has to be administered and implemented at a local level where unmet needs are known. Then you need all of this other supporting planning and infrastructure and project management infrastructure.
Anyone else?
So in the United States, very, very quickly, the New Deal created 13 million jobs. And virtually without fraud. It wasn't a perfect program, as Jan said last night. There were African Americans were pretty much left out. There was discrimination. But they did it very quickly. They produced stuff that still exists all over the country. As Bill said, our governments are much less competent today, purposely so. Jamie Galbraith's great book, Predator State, talks about the infiltration of our government by predators. And so there is a worry about this. Hyman Minsky, who advocated the employer of last resort, as he called it, used to say, I worry now about whether we could administer a program like the New Deal in the United States. And so I think it is important to decentralize it as much as possible. You have to have approval up through several different layers and ultimately at the federal level, because it is going to be a federal government-funded program. But you decentralize as much as possible. It sounds like, how on earth could we create 20 million jobs now, which of course would be smaller scale than the New Deal was, 13 million jobs, given the population growth. How could we implement that now? It seems like a task that's just impossibly big. But if you decentralize and you say, okay, take every NGO, community development organization in Kansas City and ask them, could you possibly hire 2 more people if we would pay the wages? Could you find something useful for them to do? And can you manage the work that they're going to do? And the answer is clearly going to be yes. Of course they can. So you decentralize, you don't rely on private markets, but you're relying on non-governmental entities to do most of the hiring. So I don't think that the task is that big. And you phase it in as the jobs can be created and managed. And so you might have to have some kind of a lottery to allocate the jobs in the beginning. As you scale up, and we'll never get to the 20 million, because as this program grows, you will be creating private sector jobs too.
In South, just to give some real world examples, in South Africa, the Expanded Public Works Program, which I did some evaluation for, in the first 5 years, this is a country that's got very limited infrastructure in the townships. They created 1 million jobs. And my colleagues here have much more close experience of Argentina. How many did they create? 2 quarters, about 700,000 jobs or something, was it? 687.
About 1 million jobs transition.
Yeah, but very quickly they had nearly 700,000.
Oh, I mean, but how did those, like 1 million move into the private sector?
Yeah.
I was going to jump in here with another, well, there's several questions from Twitter kind of spiraled around the same question, which is, like...
Well, yeah, I've had conversations with Congressman Khanna, and
So can everyone hear Stephanie?
the congressman out of California. His district includes Silicon Valley, and yeah, he is definitely one to watch. I think he is progressive. I'm optimistic in the sense that he reached out. He's interested. He seems to understand what's wrong with the dominant narrative. He is asking for assistance in helping his colleagues to see what's wrong with the dominant narrative, and to the extent that he's able to make inroads with his own colleagues in his caucus, I think there are some bright spots, and there are others. I won't name all of them, but he's been public about it, so I'm not reticent about saying that. But it's hard. It's very hard. And one of the things that they need, and that they've indicated that they need from us, are the kinds of talking points that make it easy for them. You know, it's not easy for them to combat these deeply ingrained beliefs, these narratives. You know, every time they appear on TV, Congressman Khanna has a new bill with Senator Brown, Sherrod Brown, and it's an expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's $1 trillion expansion. You hear the $1 trillion, and right away it's like Bernie's $1 trillion infrastructure. How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for it? You go on, you say, well, it sounds like a terrific program, but where's the money going to come from? And then, you know, if they're dissatisfied with the answer you give, then it becomes, oh, so it's going to add to the deficit. Oh, so then it's going to burden the future generation. Oh, so then it's that trickling, that domino of you know, a negative, a negative, a negative, a negative. And their response to us is, help us. Give us the talking points. Give us the narrative. What do we say in response to that? So we really do need a very good, they say, we say, sort of side by side to help them find a way to articulate why these are not rational objections or rational fears. And we've been at this a long time. I don't think we're there. I don't think we've done what we need to do to make it easy for them to do what we want to see them do. I don't think we've done it yet. And I think it's a challenge that we've got to get better at. And I work on this all the time. I mean, I try to put things in simple language. I think about framing. I know Bill thinks about framing. And we think about it in the context of how to help the political leaders themselves frame issues for their constituents. But I don't think we've done a good enough job yet. And it's a challenge. It's on us to do that.
Switching topics, I wanted to ask about climate change at some point, just because, like, I think one of the problems I think everybody, or most everybody in this room would list, is that we have an economy that seems largely oblivious to the ecosystems it sits atop of, and whether or not it's driving them to collapse. So we seem to have 2 big problems in terms of, one, we need, through either regulation, the price system, whatever, move the country's energy system off of fossil fuels. But we also have to build an enormous amount of infrastructure in terms of solar, wind, electric cars, a new grid, that kind of thing. So how can MMT apply to that, guide us through that?
Well, we can answer the question, how are you going to pay for it?
Right.
I mean, in general, the economics profession, in my view, is biased towards taking the wrong approach to these issues. And what I mean by that is that I don't, we have this idea that if we have a market-based solution, we can manipulate resources which are biological resources, natural system, by price incentives. And it sounds really nice. So you can probably manipulate the market for bananas in a local market through a price system. So at the end of the Saturday market, you lower the price if you've got an excess supply. But the problem with dealing with climate change and biological systems is that economists and probably nobody knows when they're going to die. And so even if the market system was an appropriate structure for the bananas market, it's not an appropriate system in my view for biological systems that can die, and we don't know when they're going to die, and if they do die, we're not in very good shape. And so I think that from my perspective, and this is not an MMT point, this is just a more general progressive approach. I prefer a regulative approach. And so, you know, in Australia, we're very, especially in my area, we're dependent upon coal. And it's a huge coal export area. My approach is not to have a carbon tax, but to have a regulative dictate saying to the coal industry, 20 years' time, finito, or whatever the period is, you know. And in the meantime, for the state to use its capacity, fiscal capacity, to be investing heavily in renewable energy and sustainable energy. And I think we've got to, and part of that is not just to recognise that the state can do that in a financial sense, but also that there's a legitimacy in a new progressive era of the state actually becoming a producer again. Because we've sort of got this idea now the state can't be an employer anymore and it can't be a producer. Well, in this area, it's an ideal place for the state to become a producer and invest heavily in renewable energy as it's dictating to the carbon area. See you later in X years.
Yeah, there is, just generally speaking, there's a remarkable narrative out there that the government is intrinsically by its nature incapable of creating wealth, which is kind of obviously wrong. It can build a solar array, if nothing else. It can, it can hire people to build a bridge like that. It's kind of remarkable that gets any traction, but it seems to.
Well, it's just said over and over again that a government can't create jobs. Well, of course it can. A government shouldn't run a business. Well, why not? There's no monopoly on efficient business in the private sector. Some are efficient, some aren't, depending how you define it. So that's the narrative that's got progressives have to counter regularly.
There was a panel yesterday that like Raul Carrillo was on. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Professor McCluskey, Professor Harris, and they really talked about the state and local issues where like state and local austerity deprives people of public goods, which then both leaves them vulnerable to predation by the financial system, payday lenders, that sort of thing, and also encourages arms of the municipal and state governments, particularly like police forces, to also prey on low-income populations and minority populations through fees, like effectively a debtor's prison system and all this other sort of thing. So state and local governments are not the monetary sovereign, but how can they be brought in or share in the monetary sovereign's powers to relieve all these pressures so they don't engage in this kind of austerity?
Okay. So, I mean, there really was a conspiracy, as Bill talked about earlier, to devolve responsibilities to state and local governments, and the consequences could have been foreseen, were foreseen by the groups, the think tanks, the right-wing politicians, to devolve the responsibilities so that state and local governments would need to rely on taxes and fees to pay for all of the stuff that they had to supply. And that builds this stakeholder view of government. I pay so that I get my garbage collected and so on. And they really are constrained by the revenues that they can get from taxes and fees. I mean, all of this was, I think, done on purpose. And the solution has to be that we put more of this back to the national government that doesn't face financial constraints. They face resource constraints, they don't face financial constraints. So, how do you do that? Well, block grants is one way, which we have done in the United States. There's nothing radical about it. Nixon did it. So we need more national financing of state and local government, what became their responsibilities.
Right, so like what we need, I think, is block grants, but not block grants that are used to cannibalize federal programs, like which is essentially what Cassidy Graham would do with the healthcare system. It would block grant money, but it would dissolve the federal responsibility to provide healthcare in the course of block grant. Let's see. So here's a question. So I think there's a growing chorus of lefty progressive institutions and economists that I think agree. There's a broad overlap of agreement in terms of policy that they have with MMT. I'm thinking of like Dean Baker, Jared Bernstein, CEPR, CBPP, EPI, that whole crowd. But my impression is they don't identify with MMT, and their reaction to MMT maybe ranges from like interest to bemusement to skepticism. So what is the thing they are doing that is necessary but not sufficient, and what is the extra thing that MMT brings?
To add to what I said before, they're part of this problem that I talked about, where the headline left is a problem, and they lose the arguments on all these issues because they don't have the tools to support the arguments that we offer, and for whatever reason they won't use our tools, and so they become part of the problem rather than part of the answer. Let me just add something on the energy side and the ecology side. I think the waste and inefficiency is enormous. I mean, nobody's regulating or looking at how much electricity is being used for computers. So we say we need more power, we need more solar. For what? What are we doing with it? And I would say 2/3 of it in some way is being wasted, whether it's simple things or things being left on, excess capacity and all these toys that never get used, but drawing large amounts of power. And transportation, you have a lot, I won't go into all the influences, but we've got a system set up where people are driving 30 or 40 miles to work every day, and then we're going to replace it with high-speed commuting bus. It's still the same thing. You could be living a lot closer or whatever, but there hasn't been the public purpose, drive to serve public purpose to cut down on the usage. And that alone could probably save at least 50%. You look at the growth of energy usage and look at what life was like before that, and now it's not any different. So the difference has to be just frivolous things.
I'll say
Sorry.
okay. I was on a TV show with Jared once, and the question of deficits, and I think maybe the topic was fiscal cliff or something like that. I don't exactly remember, but he was making the argument that there are ways to deal with budget challenges and financing, and we can pay for things. We just have to raise taxes on in the appropriate amount and so forth. We can deal with the long run budget challenges. We go to commercial break, so the cameras are off, and we're chatting, and I say, well, there's, of course, the government can always afford to make the payments, and it's not a question of whether they can pay. And he said, no, of course they can. If they write the check, then of course they pay for it. And I said, but you have to say that when the cameras are on. And so, it's a challenge, because he accepted it. He said, of course they can always write the check. But when the cameras are rolling and you're inside the Beltway, there's a game in Washington, and these guys are players. And I think there's a perception that what they're doing is somehow more serious than what we're doing. Okay, because they're showing the work. People say, show your work. How are you going to pay for it? This is an exercise that one must demonstrate that one is being sufficiently careful and responsible with government finances, and any new proposal is paid for. And that we come in and say, look, the government can afford to finance any program it wants. It doesn't have to raise taxes in order to do it. And it seems, I think, maybe to them, too easy, too unserious, I don't know. But I can tell you that there's plenty of rigorous modeling, there's plenty of empirical work that would need to be done, even if you accepted the claim that the government can afford to make new investments in infrastructure, address climate change, without ordering this tax revenue is going to come from here, we're going to get money from here, we're going to do this. Plenty of empirical work that they could be doing to help demonstrate how far you can go at one point in time. If we want to do $1 trillion of infrastructure investment, could we do it over 5 years, or is that too much spending, and is that going to result in an inflation problem? Do we have the resources? Do we have the labor? Bill was talking about what they did in the 50s, shelter projects. Have these studies done and be prepared to show that the occupational, right, the skills are there. If you're going to try to call up 3 million workers to build out $1 trillion of infrastructure, you need to know that you have 3 million available people with the appropriate skills and the capacity in the economy to absorb the demand without generating inflation. Somebody should do that work. And so I agree with Warren that in many cases, these people and these institutions have become part of the problem for the progressive agenda.
And my response is that people are inherently insecure. And when we're in the primary school playground, everyone wants the same pair of shoes. And if they don't have them, they feel insecure. And then a new pair of shoes seeps in, and someone takes a chance on them who's less insecure. And then after a while, everybody's got those shoes, as if they were self-evident things to have. And I think that's the idea of that's the same way in which ideas progress. There's incredible mob rule out there. There's incredible vested interest. I mean, forget the academy. The academy are not going to give up their DSG modelling because they've invested all after their PhD, their whole reputations. They're age 45 now, and they just can't. The groupthink's too strong. But the rest of the population, we're all insecure, and new ideas challenge us. And who's going to put it? Is Dean Baker going to put up his hand? He's got vested interests. He's got his perception of a reputation. I don't mean to personalise it to him, but just all of us are like that. And there's a few risk takers. Yeah, there's all this stuff. But the donors will get the new pair of shoes eventually. Don't worry. But every idea every pattern of idea changes. There's a few risk takers. And I think in terms of our profession, the 4 people at this table are risk takers. And that others will take, look at all these people now. And eventually all of these other people will find comfort in the ideas, but it takes time. That's my view of it.
Randall?
Yeah, I want to add this one.
On the pay for, particularly among progressives, there's this very strong desire to tax the rich. And so they link, the good policies they want to, will tax the rich to pay for it. And so when you point out we don't need to tax the rich to pay for it, they're just crestfallen because they want to tax the rich. So I say, of course we should tax the rich. Why? They're too rich. You don't need any other argument. They're too rich. So far it has not worked.
This is exactly right. There is an incontrollable urge to scratch 2 itches at the same time. I really want to help the poor and the struggling and address climate and all of these things. I really want to do, and God, I want to stick into the billionaire class. I really want to get it. And the pay for is perfect because it says, I'm going to offer up this progressive agenda, and I'm going to soak the rich to pay for it. Wall Street's going to pay, the billionaires are going to pay, whatever. And it gets to scratch both itches. The problem is we don't get the legislation. So kids go hungry, bridges go unrepaired, the economy stagnates, and we don't get any of the stuff that we want, and we don't get to tax the rich. And meanwhile, we've got climate. This is urgent. There's an urgency here, and we're addressing climate change in a unless and until we're able to tax the wealthy, we can't address climate change because we're supposed to get money from the rich people to help us pay for the investments in the green energy economy and so forth. It's a crazy thing for progressives.
The problem there is the rich have been framed as the job creators,
when job creation comes from consumers buying things, not from somebody with money deciding to hire somebody to whatever.
People will sometimes make a quip, right, about MMT. Oh, the magic money tree. Oh, MMT, magic money tree. Well, what we've done what we have is the conception that money grows on rich people. And that's how you pay for things. If you need to pay for something, you have to go where the money is. That's what Hillary Clinton said. If you're going to do these things, she said this in a debate, you have to go where the money is. She doesn't mean Congress. She means the wealthy, because that's where money comes from. It grows on rich people. And the idea is you have to go to the rich people tree and pluck the bills off in order to give you the money you need to pay for the other stuff is how we generally think. This is the progressive approach.
Just counterproductive.
Just a bit.
That strikes me as a strong note. We are at 10 a.m. Do we want to keep going, or do we want to like put a pin in it there? Oh. All right. We want more. Actually, are the Q&A mics on? Like, can we?
And Stephanie, can you use the table mic instead of whatever you're wearing?
Is that Sherry?
Yes.
Where are
and
you?
I want to hear you.
Oh, yeah, I can use the table. You can't hear?
Not well. Your voice breaks up with whatever you're wearing. Please use the table mic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'll go back and repeat everything.
Well, I think it was basically the money grows on Congress. It does not grow on rich people, so you don't have to get it.
So, President Obama at one point said that something about the money coming from government, and the pushback, there's serious pushback now that government doesn't create wealth, just what he said, the money comes from the private sector. He backed off. Okay? So.
All right, let's see. Are there actually? I mean, I don't know if the mics are on, but like, yeah. Let's start taking a point on it. Microphone.
What about trust busting as a means of controlling inflation when it's especially in industries that where we've had mergers and acquisitions beyond reason?
The question was, what about trust busting as a way to control inflation?
Yeah.
Hard to say that.
Oh, well, yeah. Like, explain that just into the mic real quick.
Yeah, generally those things tend to bring down prices. They're not used to collude and raise prices. There are a couple of international cartels that do that, but domestically it doesn't. If that was the case, then yes, then that would be a place to look. But there aren't too many examples now. I don't think of that happening. Do you have a specific example?
Well, I think he was talking. I mean, the cartels raise the prices, right? So, like, if you bust up the trust and get more competition, does that bring the prices down?
It would, but I don't know any examples being a problem, material problem.
Right now.
Oh, okay.
You know, it can be from time to time. It can be a serious problem, like in some of the drugs and things like that. But it's fairly isolated.
Okay. Next up.
Hi, I'd like everybody on the people on the panel and everybody in the room to kind of take up Stephanie's challenge, and that is, how do we get the word out about this? It's one thing to go to politicians, and that's important, and give them the talking points. But when they are so isolated, no one in the educated public understands what you guys are saying. I hate to be so blunt, but I think that's the truth. I've talked to a couple of senators. I'm from New Mexico, and it's easier to talk to senators. Bingaman and Udall, to be precise, and they're very polite. They're just open-mouthed when I tell them that it's possible to just create money and do these wonderful things without necessarily raising taxes. And the reason they're open-mouthed, they've never heard this before.
Well, they just voted for it 4 or 5 days ago.
Well, don't kid yourself. Don't kid yourself. People, the progressive left and educated people in general simply don't understand this. They're so ingrained in the notion that printing money is the worst thing a government can do.
Well,
and we've got to get out there. Even the American Prospect magazine has never had an article
question.
really
Two
explain
questions.
No
this.
one in this room is among the educated.
In public.
They are.
It takes time. There were in the early 90s, there were 4 or 5 of us. Now there's a room full of people, plus, as I understand, millions of people watching on live casts. It just takes time.
Point out that they can look at the Constitution. Congress has the power to create the money. That's what the Constitution says. Do it.
Galileo was 100 years after Copernicus.
You have to grab the mic now.
So anyway, I've been working on that for about 25 years now. At one point, there was only one of us in this mission. And it feels all along the way like it's not getting anywhere. And then 220 people show up to this conference, like Bill says. So it's probably working better than we thought. And Randy will talk about how it's mushroomed, and the way it's spreading now is the way it's going to spread. That's what's working. It's already working. We're growing geometrically. Whatever you're doing, just keep doing what you're doing and do more of it. But you've got an advantage, is that once people, it's like a fish hook, once people understand some of this, they never go backwards. So once you recognize that the way that government spending takes place is the Federal Reserve just changes the number in your bank account, and so the government can't run out of money, they're just changing the number. There's nothing to run out of. You don't come back a week later and say, I changed my mind, they can run out of money. So,
all right, I got another one up here.
Hi, Sam Levy. I run Deficit Owls. The fellow before me sort of co-opted my question, but I'm seeing a lot of, the academic work on this, I feel, is largely complete. And, it's gotten to the point where you hear from Warren or from Randy, we take this to politicians and they say, oh my God, that's incredible, but I can't say that. They need a mass movement behind this before the politicians will be able to acknowledge it publicly. So my question is, what are some concrete steps that we might be able to take, and I mean, by we, I mean individual non-academic people might be able to take to build that mass movement, to spread these ideas, to promote it, and what should our priorities be? Should we be educating local candidates? Should we be going out to school newsletters? Like, what might be the first things that we ought to be doing? Thank you.
Talk to Jesse Meyerson. Talk to Raul, talk to Rowan. I feel like that's a question for people who engage in movement building. This isn't we're the academics behind the scholarly work, but I don't think I can't answer the question. You may have ideas about how to tackle that, but for building out a popular movement, that's why we did this event where we brought all of you together with us, because that's what we hope we can accomplish together, together.
I recall accompanying that date, it maybe it was about 2004, we were having a meeting of the 4 of us. I'm not sure whether you were there actually, maybe there was only the 3 of us. And I'd been mucking around on some IT, and I found out that there was this thing called a blog. It was early days in blogging, and I told these guys here, well, I'm going to start a blog. And Randy sort of looked at me as if I was from outer space. And so I started my blog 2004, and eventually everyone started blogs there, even Warren. Warren had sworn.
I had a bullet board.
Yeah, you had a bulletin board.
I said, what's the difference?
Yeah, and Warren, here's Warren swearing blue murder to me that he would never have a mobile phone even, and so he even got a blog, and that was the first way in which we could conceive of taking our academic work out into the public, and now our blogs, I think, are quite successful in terms of just measured by number of people who access them. And then the tweets came along, and then Facebook pages, and then that's the way it's going to happen. It takes time, as I said, and the more people that use the social media networks, That's grassroots movements are now emerging through social media because it's free. The old political dialogue, the old political institutional way of having town meetings and that, forget all that. And so just keep doing, as Warren said, just keep doing more and more and exploiting the work that we do if you find it sensible and broadcast it.
And support these candidates. I mean, I've got DM messages in my Twitter feed and emails from people who are on board with MMT. They understand, they have taken the approach, and now they're running for public office, and that includes the federal offices. So when these candidates are out there, I hope we can do what we can to support their candidacy and get more people in Congress who have this sort of understanding. I tell a very quick story. I know there's a line of people who want to get a question in, but Warren and I went to DC, I don't know how many years ago, a long time ago, and we sat down with a congressman who happens to represent the district we're sitting in right now. And we were brought in, and Warren had a copy of his book, and we sat down, we got about an hour with him, and Warren did most of the talking, and I sat there and I watched. And this congressman just winced and grimaced and shuffled around his chair. This was the most painful thing he ever had to sit through in his entire life. And Warren's laying out the case, and all of a sudden, the light bulb moment. And I could see it happen. I knew that it clicked for him. At some point, 40-some minutes in, he got it. And he leaned across his desk and he clasped his hands and he said in a very low voice, "I can't say that." and we said, "You don't have to. You don't have to. It's not that you have to come out with this, cleansing of your conscience and tell everyone in the sort of language that you just heard. Just don't say stupid. Don't repeat the deficit and it's sometimes it's as important what you don't say as what you do say. Just make the correct votes. Support good policy. Don't trump up problems with deficit and debt and so forth. You don't have to necessarily go out and teach MMT to the world, but you can be a better policymaker just by, virtue of the fact that you understand the fiscal space that you have and make policies that take advantage of that understanding." No, he didn't do that.
Thank you. Could you please give us kind of an outline or a comparison of the job guarantee versus the basic income guarantee?
Okay, so Harrison, the universal basic income basically is a plot to create us to divert attention from the government having a responsibility to create full employment. It's a denial of that capacity, and the solution then is to construct us as consumption units only, where we'll be dolloped out a little bit of cash so that we can keep the realisation crisis from pending. In other words, we buy a few bits and pieces, and we'll be told to shut up and stay quiet and stop agitating for full employment. That's what universal basic income is. Whenever CEOs of companies that have appalling labour practices start coming out for a policy, I get suspicious. Whereas a job guarantee is a right of citizenship. It's a framework for price stability and full employment, and it's an explicit recognition that the government has the fiscal capacity to honour its responsibilities to all of the international covenants under human rights and whatever, that the government ultimately has the responsibility to provide jobs for all. And it's also a recognition that employment in our cultural milieu is still a very important way in which we achieve self-esteem and confidence within social networks. Universal basic income is, in my view, a denial of all of that.
Okay, we have four questions.
Let me just say it's even worse than that quickly. I agree with Bill, but I call it a transition job, by the way, because it promotes the transition to the private sector, because private sector employers don't like to hire people who are unemployed. So if someone's unemployed, number one, the private sector doesn't want to hire you. If you give that person a basic income, you have not changed that. So it doesn't facilitate employment. So it works, in fact, it works against it. And so it's not, I'm not totally against it, but if you're going to have some kind of basic income, it's got to be in the context of a transition job or a job, if not by itself.
Okay, so I've told them quick questions, so we also probably need quick answers.
All right. So I'm going to speak one quick question after organizing. I don't think I get to do that once. So obviously we have the job guarantee worked out very well. We have MMT worked out, how things work, clearing, the whole thing. Kolesky wrote the paper in the 40s, Political Aspects of Full Employment, where he made the arguments against why vested interests have a systematic interest in keeping an unstable economy, having unemployed people. And I'm just wondering your opinions on that argument in light of today. Obviously, the MMT has advanced way beyond where Kolesky was, these ideas and whatnot, and I'm just wondering what your takes are on that, those arguments or that approach maybe. 30 seconds or less.
First of all, it was 1940. Sorry, it was the 1940s. So correct, you were correct.
Oh, good.
But the point I'm saying is think back to what the situation was then under fixed exchange rates and all the rest of it. So it's a different situation altogether. And you know, I'm a great fan of Michael Kolesky, as probably everyone knows, but he was wrong on that because we maintained truthful employment for years. Because the social democratic governments responded to the pressure from citizens to take responsibility to create jobs that weren't created elsewhere in the economy. And yeah, there was opposite as in Kolesky's verb.
Words, captains of industry. I didn't do anything.
Oh, we lost the mic over there.
Yeah, well, the captains of
Can we
industry opposed.
hand him the other mic?
Turn it on, just switch it.
We should be quick. The captains of industry opposed it, but the power of the social democratic narrative was so powerful. Capital has always hated full employment. The right to work has always been opposed by capital. But the citizens' power overrides capital when we use it properly.
Very quickly, today, it's the exporters who are against full employment and want to keep prices and wages down so they can, wages down and demand down so that they can, because their customers are not in that country, they're overseas. The domestic employers are not against it, it's the exporters. And so the exporters shouldn't even have a seat at the table with domestic policy because their interests are different. They're not bad people, they just have different interests. And yet, when President Obama made the statement, we need to consume less and export more, okay, totally against the public interest. And then who does he bring on as his chief economic advisor then? Jeff Immelt from GE, our big exporter. So one of the major problems in the world is that these exporters are in control and they have no consideration for the domestic well-being.
Alon Altman from Berkeley, California. Thank you for your time. Going back to the common thread that the MMT challenge is a framing challenge, just wondering, I had heard George Lakoff's name mentioned. Has anyone reached out to a framing expert like George within the MMT community? And he's in my town. I went to see him speak and I asked him if he heard about MMT and he said, no, I'd love to learn. My email is george.lakoff@gmail.com. They sent me some stuff. I felt conscious about engaging in myself. I'm just wondering, I mentioned your names. He said I hadn't heard about it. He said he'd love to learn. We need a new economy for...
I'll write to him.
Please.
We're fans. Randy's written about him. I think I came to you and I talked about Lakoff at some point. Then you read his stuff. Don't think of an elephant. He should do another version. Don't think of a don't think of a donkey. And update along MMT lines. You like Lakoff's work. I think we all do. And he's very good at what he does, but he is himself trapped in the wrong paradigm. So if we could get collaboration with him, it would be terrific. I actually am working with him on a project, but it's not MMT related, so I can talk to him at some point about this. I can't say more.
My name is Robin Cash. I'm from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. And earlier the question was posed about how other jurisdictions could participate in the federal government's money creation powers. And I've been wondering for some time if public banking might be a way to do that, with local jurisdictions being able to finance their own development operations, would short circuit the bond market, at least part of the bond market, and would enable greater local control of expenditures and not have local jurisdictions be at the behest of federal entities and regional entities quite so much. So I wonder if also establishing such public banking would be providing facts on the ground for MMT and be a means of educating the public and building a constituency for broader applications of it.
It would work functionally, but I prefer just federal grants, maybe on a per capita basis to all the localities, a sufficient amount of funds rather than fool with all the loan documents and the idea of repaying and whatnot. I think a federal grant is a way to go if it's public infrastructure serving public purpose, distributed in some equitable manner. And just eliminate that layer of bureaucracy. I don't see any advantage to it.
I have a brief question about framing. In the Midwest, I think among young people, there's a kind of a brand of right-wing politics that is contingent on a certain kind of moral slogan. And since y'all are chartalists, I wonder how you would respond to this notion that taxation is theft.
Well, it's coercive. There's no question about it. And it's what supports collective action. And what you're getting back is public infrastructure for public purpose. And if you don't believe that has any value, number one, I think you're making a mistake, but that's what you're arguing, right?
Well, it underlies our monetary system. So, I mean, we could go back and live in the caves, but we need something to drive the monetary system.
I'm aware we all want to get out of here, but that exploits a very strong metaphorical resonance in us. But mentioned the word person Laycock before. And I'll talk about this next session. But what we know is there's a concept in human cognition called construal, and that's the way in which we understand things and interpret things. And you can always, through skillful language and framing, you can always use a negative metaphor and turn it into a positive experience by relating it to what's called a destination through a causality structure. So instead of just saying government's raising taxes, a progressive should always use the word tax in the same sentence as Warren said. A destination. What's a destination that will resonate nicely? Public schools, well in Australia, public schools, public hospitals, nice parks, roads, whatever. And so you can turn off the metaphorical negative and turn it into a positive. That's how I would respond to that sort of taxes theft argument, because that's metaphorically bad. Whereas taxes associated with the creating the fiscal space to provide a beautiful park, that's turning it the other way.
Okay, so before we thank the panelists, I just wanted to note that there are refreshments on the third floor. Panels will begin in about 10 minutes. And so now, let's thank our panelists for a wonderful time.